You've actually traveled all over the developing world
Yes.
doing this work. Tell us a little bit about what you found in Africa, and tell us a little bit about China, which I thought was a particularly interesting and surprising chapter in the book.
Yeah, this links in with what Gary was saying, that I had a really lucky break. So I was in Hyderabad. I went back to the World Bank offices, first in Delhi, then Washington, to tell them, hey, you know, isn't this extraordinary? You know, there are all these private schools, the government schools, poor parents don't want to go there. They're not good enough, you know. Isn't this extraordinary? And people in the World Bank just met me with this sort of, you know, well, almost disgusted look, really, saying, you know, what on earth are you on about, Thule? You know, I mean, you may have found one or two of these local private schools, but they are rubbish. You know, they're part of the problem. They need to be closed. You know, they're a symptom of a problem. Please don't tell us they're anything other than a problem. And so I realized there were three things I had to find out. One was how many children are going to these schools? What proportion are there? It seemed to me when I was in the slums that there were a majority of school children in these schools. But, you know, we had to find out. Secondly, the crucial question, how good were they? Because the people in the World Bank and others I spoke to said they were just businessmen ripping off the poor. They were, you know, there were no quality solution at all. How good were they? And the third thing I was interested in was, what is their business model? Because then, of course, if they had an interesting business model, then they could really impact on the development debate. And so then the John Templeton Foundation, I was fortunate to meet Charles Harper at a conference in Goa. Someone has to go. And he got interested in this idea. I took him to see some private schools in Goa. Although I didn't know they were there, we just went out and we found some. And he encouraged me to put in this proposal. And I said, let's go look in Kenya, Ghana, Nigeria, India, and China. And it was extraordinary. In all the urban areas I looked in Kenya, the slums like Kibera, one of the largest slums in sub-Saharan Africa, the slums in Nigeria, like Makoko, which featured in the BBC film we did, the slums of Accra in Ghana. In all those places, we found the same figure. The vast majority, 65 to 75% of school children were in these low-cost private schools. The same picture of entrepreneurs from those poor communities themselves, building these schools, serving the parents. The same story of poor parents who didn't want their children to be abandoned in the public schools, taking them to the private. But China, you asked me about China as well. China was slightly different. I used to go around in conferences, a bit like this one, telling people about my work. And everywhere I went after I would go, you know, I've been to India or Africa, Nigeria, and I'd say, look at what I found. Is it the same in your country? And in Beijing, it was absolutely not. You will not find any low-cost private schools in China. Absolutely not. And in a way, when you go to Beijing or Shanghai now, you know, it makes New York sometimes seem like a little village sometimes, doesn't it, these places? And then one of the aid agencies, the British aid agency, DFID, said, we're working in rural Gansu, one of the poorest places in China. We know those villages intimately. You will not find any private schools there. So, as a red rag to this bull, I went to Gansu province. I went into the mountains to the villages where there were public schools, true enough. And everyone said, no, there are no private schools. And then I was with a PhD student, now Dr. Liu Chang. And one morning he got up very early, went to the markets and asked of the women, you know, were there private schools? And they said, yes, if you go another day's journey into the mountains, you will find them. So we went another day's journey up into the most remote villages almost on this earth, I would think, you know. And there, sure enough, at the end of the earth, there was a little low-cost private school. And who was it serving? It was serving poor parents, peasant farmers, and there was a public school for them in the main village, but it was, you know, 3 or 4 hours walk away. And poor parents, particularly parents of girls, didn't want their children doing that. It's impossible in the winter anyway, you know. They get snow as bad as we've had here, you know. And so these little private schools were serving these remote little villages in the mountains. Extraordinary feeling of finding something that, you know, was waiting to be uncovered, really.